There are around 608 million farms in the world. Our survival as a species quite literally depends on them. They are the anchors and sources of stability for communities in which they operate. With a growing population demanding more agricultural produce, and geopolitics, war, supply chain dysfunction, and a changing climate threatening supply, the world is looking for innovative solutions to a looming agricultural crisis. It may seem strange to ask the question of how Web3 and blockchain technologies can help, but that's exactly what we're going to do in this episode of W3B Talks. Welcome to W3B Talks, an ongoing exploration of the impact of Web3 and blockchain technologies on business, government, and society. My name is Doug Heinzman. I'm the Chief Catalyst of the Blockchain Research Institute. To help us understand how Web3 and blockchain technologies are impacting agriculture, we are joined today by John Task. John's the CEO of Demetra. He's also on the Scala Working Group of the United Nations. Demetra is a global ag tech company that uses blockchain technology, mobile technology, machine learning, IoT devices, satellite and drone imagery, genomics, and advanced farming research to help smallholder farmers across the world be more productive. Welcome to the podcast, John. How are you?
I am fantastic, Doug. Thanks for having me here today.
I'm delighted that you're joining us today. This is a topic that I think is very important and that we should be talking more about. Before we kind of get into all of this, I mentioned that you're on the Scala Working Group of the United Nations. Just what is Scala for those of us who aren't kind of tied into all the United Nations working groups?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The United Nations has a group of, corporate and government citizens who help some of their executives and leaders problem solve challenges, and particularly Scala is scaling up climate ambition on land use and agriculture. So we're really focused on land use, how the impact of climate fits into that, and how it all bundles together in agricultural context.
Okay, so as we get into this conversation, let's just set the table, so to speak, and just define some terms and deal with some of the scoping issues. I mentioned in the intro that there's approximately 608 million farms in the world. How many of those farms, I'm expecting that a lot of those farms are these smallholder farms. Can you just kind of help us understand what a smallholder is, how many of them are there, and how many farmers, how many people are we really talking about that are impacted?
Yeah, I mean, a smallholder farm, there's a few definitions depending on who you ask, but typically the accepted definition is a farm that's less than 4 hectares. A smallholder farm around the world produces about 35% of the world's produce. And there's about 570 million farms that fit the definition of smallholder farm. And that represents about 3 billion people in our world. So pretty significant number of people, number of users, potential users of the system, and a lot of people who really struggle to be productive relative to the precedent set by larger industrialized farms.
Yeah, well, so it's fascinating you mention that because, I suppose in my little bubble of a world here, right? I go down to the grocery store and I, get some vegetables, and some of them are from local farms, and, I go to local market stuff. But for the most part, they come in nice, saran wrap packaged boxes and stuff. And I'm expecting that they're kind of produced by, industrial farms at scale. But my experience with agriculture is probably the distinct minority in the world. The vast majority of the world interacts with agriculture in a fundamentally different way. Am I right in that assumption?
Yeah, absolutely. You look at a lot of these farms and a lot of the communities that we work in around the world, and typically somebody will go get their produce at a local farmer's market or a central market. And every day the farmer goes out and picks a certain amount of crop, loads up a basket and runs down to that farmer's market and trades during the day in order to make their living.
So I in the intro, I talked about some of the challenges, right? We've heard about the impact of the reduction in wheat, which is a staple grain for so many people in the world because of the war in Ukraine. And many of us are very familiar with the climate change threat to agriculture because, you know, certain crops can't exist in certain climates, and the rising incidence of drought and floods, and the different populations of various different kinds of insects and pests that are enabled because of climate change. Are those the key challenges facing agriculture? What other big challenges out there facing agriculture?
Yeah, I think there's different groups of challenges. And if you look at developing nations and you look at people classed in that smaller farm, the smallholder farmer class, their ability to analyze their soil and react to those problems you described, like climate challenges and pest challenges, are much more limited relative to a big industrial farm. So if we take them as a group, how does a small farm react to a certain pest, fall armyworm? And there's a real lack of technology available to these groups. And part of that is because the technology is expensive. And the small farmer who's selling $1,000 or $5,000 worth of produce a year has a hard time buying a technology that's $300, $500, $1,000, where larger industrialized farms have no problem spending $1,000 in order to do that. So that's part of the reason that we focus our effort on those small farms, because the technology can be delivered to them at a much lower cost.
So, yeah, I remember reading a little while ago I forgot what journal it was, but talking about the practices that have gone back ages, but this one's happened to be in Brazil, of how small farmers every year would kind of clear cut and then burn a section of the Amazon in order to plant crops or to get, cattle grazing. And the soil that's there that is now exposed to sunlight that hasn't been because of the rainforest canopy, kind of turns to ceramic after a couple of years and is unplantable. So they go off and they cut down the next hectare of rainforest. And on the one hand, I'm thinking to myself, this is crazy and it's not sustainable and it's, it's hurting the planet, et cetera. And on the other hand, for that farmer and their family and the community they live in, given the technology they have at hand, what other options do they have? So I end up being very highly conflicted. And as I read more about what Dimitra's doing, I started to get some hope that, maybe the technology can be brought to bear that gives these farmers more options that make a lot more sense in the grander scheme. Is that wishful thinking, or is the reality behind that?
No, there's an absolute reality beyond that. I started farming as a child with my grandfather, and my grandfather had different practices that he used. So these aren't practices that are necessarily set in the Amazon or in India or wherever. There's practices that have been passed down through the generations. And, in the last 10, 20, 30 years, we've learned a lot about how to farm differently. And industrial farms operate completely differently than a small farm or smallholder farm would. We now understand how to work with the soil and work with the soil in a sustainable way. And one of the big efforts that we have to do is we have to take those 3 million people around the world and help them understand there's different ways to farm that are going to produce better results with the soil and better results with the crops. So there's a huge education piece, and technology, with the penetration of mobile technology around the world, is really an enabler to that. So that's one of the key pieces to the Dimitra platform, is how do we educate? How do we provide alternatives to our user farmers around the world so they can understand how do you farm in a regenerative fashion? And that may not be nice, clean row crops that an industrial farm has. That may be, corn interspersed with quinoa or another crop. You have one crop that takes a nutrient out of the soil and another crop that can actually help put some of that nutrient back into the soil. Also having cover crops that protect the soil from the sun and keep those nutrients there in the soil and keep those nutrients at a level that's important for growing so that you're actually getting nutrients at the roots as opposed to having them washed away by rains and washed away by flooding, keeping them right in the soil where the farmers need it.
Right. Okay. So that's really interesting. There's obviously, you've alluded to a bunch of kind of techniques about balancing nutrients and mixing crops in healthier ways, and I can well understand how all of that kind of goes to productivity. Before I know, I want to talk about some more specifics about how the technology is being deployed, but I just want to park that for a quick second, and I want to try to get inside of your head as you were thinking through, from an entrepreneur standpoint, that's, I want to build a business. I'm going to go and solve this problem. And some of that stuff you were just talking about are obviously, means to solving the problem, and we can deploy technology to address that. But in terms of market targeting, before we get to that conversation, in terms of market targeting, your website says that that every smallhold farmer, regardless of economic status, should be able to benefit from simple, beautiful, and useful technology. Because when farmers thrive, economies thrive. So you've obviously kind of selected as your target marketplace these smallhold farmers that, by this definition are kind of economically marginal, many of them, and yet I'm suspecting kind of play an essential role in their communities and frankly, the planet writ large. But how did you decide on that group of people as your target audience? I mean, at the most cursory level, it seems that group of people wouldn't necessarily have access to some of the enabling technologies or the technology literacy to be able to effectively consume the kinds of services that you're offering. So why target them?
Yeah, so I guess I mentioned before, I have an affinity to farming. Like my grandfather was a farmer and taught me some of the techniques of farming as a child, and I worked as a child on his farm. Secondarily, a number of years ago, I was working on a project in Africa to implement an identity system and started interacting with different businesses, different groups of people in Africa, and very quickly learned that the way that they farm in Africa is very different than the way that we farm in North America. And the access level they have to information and technology is completely different. And, I bring that back to my team. We start talking about it and find that it's something that we can do quite simply with a mobile app and help them understand different farming techniques and bring them techniques like satellite reports and machine learning, track and trace through blockchain. And technology like this doesn't have to be expensive. And when you start looking at penetration of mobile phones, we're doing work in India where penetration of mobile phones with even farmers is at a very high level, 90%. Africa, a lot of the communities we're in, here's 50, 60% penetration of mobile phones. And certainly there's some areas where you need to work from a technology enablement perspective. We went into Indonesia and started working with coffee farmers in Indonesia. And one of their challenges was really understanding how to use an app. And, there's great ways to help those farmers. In Indonesia, for example, we partnered with the local university and had university students go out 30 days at a time teaching the farmers how to use the app. The university students were getting data for their graduate research, and we were getting the benefit of those university students who were quite capable of using a mobile app to help the farmers understand how to put their data in.
Okay, you've touched on a whole bunch of things there that I wanted to kind of dig into and to try to organize my thoughts here. Actually, let's start with the question of this role that they play, right? So, addressing farmer productivity is kind of, one thing that allows them to individually and for their families to have, a more viable economic means and to be able to kind of, produce more and more profitably. But my understanding is that these farmers, especially because of their number, they play a pretty important role beyond their kind of raw agricultural role in terms of the stability and the structure, the fabric of their communities. Do you see that when you travel around the world?
Yeah, we absolutely see that. You look in some of the countries that we're working in, and agriculture can be 10, 20, 60% of GDP. The vast majority of people are working in producing food, not only for the local economy, but for the nation from an export perspective. And those individual farmers really play a role from a community perspective. They share with each other. They work on growing different crops. They share knowledge. And as blockchain and Web3 are very community oriented. Farming is probably the original community activity in the world. Such an important group of people who get together outside of religion. They're focused on caring for a small group of people. And in Africa, it could be a small community or village who have been getting together to share food for centuries. So very important to the fabric of society, particularly in today's world. The other piece is, how do those communities play a role in reducing world hunger? So they not only are playing a huge role in producing food, but the distribution of food and the local distribution of food and making sure that everybody eats is really a community challenge. Although we tend to call it a global challenge and we approach it differently in North America, we have food banks down the road from me here. In Africa, that doesn't always exist, and Asia and some more developing economies.
Well, that observation in some ways is a good proxy for kind of the next question I was going to ask. That you were talking about the variability, right? That farmers, and for that matter, the community dynamic in Thailand or in Ethiopia or in Brazil, that they're not all the same, right? That first of all, there are just different crops, and there's different land, and there's different climate considerations, different weather patterns, different regulatory environments, different marketplaces, but also different kinds of communities and community structures. So, the first part of the question is that correct? And assuming it is correct, how does a company like Demetra, address that variability between all your very small customers?
We look specifically at maybe 25 crops right now, and we're continuing to add crops every month. There is variability from a crop perspective, and there is variability brought on by climate change and temperatures and humidity levels and moisture and water availability. One of the great things with technology, and particularly today in the AI world with machine learning, is that we can assess so many more facets of data. And, it's been difficult for us to do that over the years. We've greatly relied on agronomists to make recommendations, and we still rely on those agronomists today. But now we can bring in a data set that takes a feed from satellite data. It takes a feed from farmers' observations on their farm. What pests are they seeing? What diseases are they seeing? What's the condition of their soil? We can take data like soil analysis and look at the nutrient levels and help make plans. And part of what we do at Dimitra is find a way to deal with that variability, to help the farmer put together a plan that's not only going to feed the family at the end of the year and contribute to that community, but be effective at doing that and make good decisions that are going to maximize productivity.
Okay, so let's roll our sleeves up a little bit and start talking about some of the technology and some of the tangible implementations and examples, if you have some. Some of the big components of the Web3 platform, blockchain, AI, IoT, these are all technologies that Dimitra is using. So let's start with blockchain, right, as kind of the foundational state engine. But how are you using this technology to deliver your the information you have in your system to the farmers so that they can take action on that information?
Yeah, so blockchain plays a couple roles. And the first role is really an immutable repository for information. Farmers, when they're shipping their goods, need to be able to prove to the buyers where that product came from. And there's a lot of distrust in industry that needs to be addressed. Blockchain provides a great tool for enabling trust because it enables visibility, it enables transparency. So, one example with our coffee platform is that we share data to provide traceability, from the farm through the buying station, through the mills that convert the cherries into coffee beans, right through the end buyer, trader, or roaster. And we track every person in the supply chain, and everybody in that supply chain now has access to that blockchain so that they can see what each stakeholder is doing. And that can be in a public format or in a private format, depending on the corporation we're dealing with. Most of them are on a public format right now. So that's one way that we deal with blockchain. Another one is
John, just before we go off of that point, because the deforestation question is, I think, a really interesting case in point. And you talked about the blockchain's role in terms of providing transparency and visibility to the various different components of the ecosystem of the supply chain, and of course, that visibility just leads to collectively higher quality decision making across the entire supply chain or ecosystem. But there's also the regulatory impact that, my understanding is that there's a bunch of countries around the world, including the EU, that are, forcing, putting deforestation regulation around a bunch of kind of staple goods like coffee and cocoa and palm oil and rubber and cattle and a bunch of other things, that says that you can't sell into our marketplace if you're deforesting in order to, harvest that product. And you need to be able to prove to us that this cattle, this coffee, this rubber, isn't coming from a place that is harming the environment through deforestation. Is that true? And can I use Dimitra's technology to allow me as a farmer to sell my goods into those marketplaces?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the modules, and we have a platform that's available within Dimitra. So, Dimitra is made up of 5 applications that we've built, and one of them is completely deforestation focused. And then some of our farming products also add that as a module, so farmers can report their deforestation status. At a really high level, We take satellite information. So a farmer tells us, here's my farm. They create a geofence within the system, and they tell us what the boundaries of their geofence is. We then take machine learning, and we've analyzed entire countries, country of Brazil, Colombia. We're doing states in Indonesia and different places. And what we do is we teach the machine learning to differentiate between trees and crops. And then the EU, for example, has set a cutoff for its nations to say, you can't buy goods if they were produced on land that was deforested since 2020. So we take a snapshot of what 2020 looks like, December 2020, and we take a snapshot when somebody asks for a report. The machine learning now tells us how many trees have been removed from that land as a percentage, how many trees have been added to that land, and is that land a net deforester, or are they adding to the forest, or are they flat? We take that information then and we produce a certificate, and we write that certificate right now to the Polygon blockchain. And we take all of that information and we certify on a shipment level that an individual farm has not deforested since the cutoff. We also do some verification that the crop had been produced on that farm. And we also use some GPS data to make sure that the farmer and the device was on that farm. So those are fraud prevention activities. We bundle that all up, stick that on the deforestation certificate, and all that's funded with our Dimitra token. So every time we do this, there's a fee that comes in. We have some bills, some filing fees that we have to pay. They come off, and everything else works within the token. So our token is the fuel that drives all of those transactions. So it's a great combination of blockchain, artificial intelligence, and agronomy.
Okay, so
look at that.
So this is fascinating, and it actually kind of jumps to a topic I wanted to get to. I've been spending a lot of time looking at the carbon marketplace and carbon marketplaces and carbon tracing, and of course there is understandably a fair amount of kind of skepticism about whether all carbon credits are created equal, and how do we certify the veracity of a particular claim. And you've talked about the auditing and the fraud prevention to make sure that yes, this crop actually did come from this place, was farmed by these people, that it isn't, they didn't do deforestation or whatever, and you can kind of put that digital certificate in place that provides enough confidence to the regulators that allow them to import those goods and expose them to their marketplace. And that's great. And I, to meet that threshold, of course, I expect is a tremendous boon to the farmers involved that, allow them to get access to those marketplaces. You mentioned that the fuel for this is the Dimitra token. I understand, the role of machine learning, and I understand the role of blockchain for the tracking and tracing, and the regulatory threshold issues. The idea that there is a token that fuels this, can you help us really understand how that, the coinage aspect of this really plays into making the system work?
Yeah. So first, we start within our application, and every farmer can register, and they can pay fiat, and we'll convert it to a token, or they can pay a discounted rate and use our token in order to pay for their license fees. And there's a number of ways that we use that. One is, as the farmer enters data in our system, they're generating value. And that data is valuable not only to the farmer, but valuable to universities who are doing research, and valuable to other organizations. And we have a partnership with Ocean, and we have within our system, we can take that data and actually resell that data on a marketplace in order to provide tokens back to the farmer. The farmer can then use those tokens to pay for their deforestation certificate or next year's license. And now we've created a small economy of that. Every time that we create a certificate, after we pay the government fees, and the governments won't accept a Dimitra token or crypto, everything else works with the token that we have. So we have satellite fees that we need to pay for. We have fees on AWS that we need to pay for. And everything is bundled together. And from a token perspective, we're using that token not only to be a funding mechanism, but be the mechanism to write the data to the blockchain. And so when we're doing that, we're consuming tokens. In some instances, in countries that allow it, we're burning tokens. And we're allowing more funding to go back and have a circular economy within the token for the farmer, where they can earn credit for future usage as well, knowing that farmer needs to have not one deforestation certificate, but many throughout the year.
So this is fascinating. An awful lot of the potential of kind of this Web3 era that we're kind of moving into is the potential of not only having these records that multiple participants in an ecosystem can interact with and build common business logic around them, but this idea that there is a currency that can, first of all, facilitate the exchange of value inside of an ecosystem, but second of all, efficiently distribute the value created by that ecosystem to the various different stakeholders in the ecosystem. And I know that academically. I've read it, I understand all the tokenomics of it, but to hear about this kind of real world example of how, the crypto aspect, and I use, crypto in kind of the technical term that, there's a digital asset here that is accommodating efficient interaction inside the ecosystem. I find this absolutely fascinating, the idea that, if you try to do all of those interactions through various different, fiat interactions, the cost of it would be prohibitive, and the ability to distribute that value, I suspect, a lot more complex. So, is this, how much of your thinking as you kind of put together delivering this information as a service, did you kind of think through the whole kind of tokenomics of the mechanism? How essential is it to the vision of what you're trying to accomplish?
Well, I think it's critical from a couple facets. One is from a cost savings perspective, the cost of registering that transaction with a Visa charge or a PayPal charge just is too much for a smallholder farmer on the side of a mountain in Indonesia to bear. The second is that most of them don't have credit cards. Most of them don't have access to financial mechanisms that we take for granted here in North America. It's very difficult to put them in a good economic position to be able to sell their product across borders in today's current financial situation. And so, we partner with the cooperative, and the cooperative pays for and buys that initial license fee or that initial transaction. And then the farmer now moves into a method where they can transact, they can earn tokens, they can spend tokens in a mirror economy. And at some point, they may choose to take those tokens and convert them to US dollars or local Indonesian currency. At the same time, kind of allows them to overcome the burdens of today's financial situation and today's financial mechanisms. And that's changing all over the world. So we think it's critical for smallholder farmers to have access to tokens and a system that is token driven. Doesn't mean our system won't work with fiat. It doesn't mean that you can't pay with US dollars if that's your choice as a farmer. But I would say that the vast majority of those farmers would really struggle in a system that they have to have a Visa card, or really struggle in a system where they have to walk 10 miles into the bank in order to do a transaction. Where within a mobile application, you can have on ramps and off ramps of various tokens at a very low gas cost if you're picking the correct token in order to enable their success.
So, I mean, this token has a very distinctive utility inside of that particular ecosystem. Is that the limit of its exposure? I mean, can I, as an individual, I don't know, support or invest in this ecosystem by interacting with Dimitra tokens, or is it really just the exclusive use for the people that are involved in every single part of that ecosystem?
Yeah, so we have investors all over the world, and if you can go in and KYC, you certainly can be an investor in the Dimitra token. We have mechanisms like staking that allow investors to earn based on the profitability of our entire ecosystem. And right now we're returning about 13%. And this is not investment advice, by the way. But we we allow those investors who are buying the tokens to lock those tokens for a period of time. And if they do that, they can provide free license fees to individual farmers. So if you bought $100 worth of tokens and you choose to lock that for a 1 year period, you can pick the project you want and say, I want to support a project in Indonesia or Bolivia or one of about 6 or 8 countries that we have on there right now, by providing a free license. At the same time, you're not giving up your initial investment of tokens or waiving your right to the staking or any potential market change that may occur. So we have so many great investors today who believe in agriculture. Agriculture is a growing field, and we are heavily vested in building a global agricultural ecosystem, and that there's potential from that. They believe from a charitable perspective that they want to support farms that focus on deforestation, that focus on clean water and clean soil, and using a system that does that. So absolutely, anybody can invest. The main users of the system, however, are all farmers that are coming out of these cooperatives and NGOs and governments.
Okay, on that topic, NGOs and governments, I'm expecting that, first of all, you're not making 570 million, sales calls to engage all these various different farmers. And I also expect that governments, that a central plank of their governance and of their policy formation and administration has to do with agriculture, especially in a lot of developing countries. So would I be right to expect that an awful lot of your time is spent with governments, NGOs, agencies, nonprofits?
Yeah, so we don't have the ability to sell to an individual farmer. The cost is just prohibitive for us to go out and try to sell each individual farmer in an area where a lot of the farmers maybe aren't spending much time on social media or looking at ads online. So in order for us to be successful, we really focus on cooperatives. Farmers tend to work in cooperatives in order to get bulk buying opportunities, bulk selling opportunities, again, from a community perspective, to share knowledge. And then a lot of those cooperatives are supported by governments or NGOs on particular products or projects that are focused on individual crops or individual livestock projects. So, around the world, we have a team that is knocking on doors and cooperatives And, if you look at our social media, you'll see when we sign one up, I'm talking about Indonesia. Our primary customer in Indonesia is a cooperative called Solek Rajo, and Solek has about 3,500 farms on the side of a mountain in the Solek region. And in Honduras, we've recently done a deal with coffee producers, about 100,000 coffee producers coming out of Apro Cafe. So now Apro Cafe is enabling us to access their farmers and regionally and very prescriptively go through and build up and train groups of farmers. So when we sign a 100,000 farmer deal, 100,000 farmers don't come on board right away. We bring on 300 and then 1,000, and then continually find a mechanism to create proponents of our system within their cooperative to help train new people when they come on board.
So this may be an issue that hasn't arisen yet, but sometimes, providing information to a farmer so that they can figure out how to mix crops and create diversity that, mitigates risk because of, stop the spread of pests or that. And I understand you also do genomic tracing to understand what strains of what crops or what animals would be best suited for what emerging climate dynamics and those sorts of things, which is great. But in much the same way that, when I'm driving around in traffic and I'm using Waze, the kind of information that Waze provides to me will actually change by the number of people using Waze, right? That the very fact that people use the information at hand changes the background information, right? And thus the advice that you might give. So have you already run into the issue? Do you foresee the issue of getting to the point where you have so many people that are leveraging this information that you have to start spreading it out, and two people that are side by side might not get quite the same information because collectively there is productivity or risk mitigation that the ecosystem needs to consider? Or is that just too far in the future?
No, we already encounter that today. We look at two farms side by side and start with the geofence and run a satellite report. And we have 23 analyses that come off that spectral imagery that tell us about the health of the crops. And those two farms sitting side by side that may be running the same crop could be exposed to the same soil type with different nutritional values. So as we get information back from one farmer and the one next door, if the soil nutrition is different because of how they've been using the soil over the years, we're going to provide them with different advice. The same thing with moisture. Moisture level could be different. If you're, a farm slightly downhill from your neighbor farm, your moisture levels may be different and you need different advice. And so we look at satellite, we look at topographical information, we look at weather information, we look at the farmer observations where they tell us about their soil or they tell us about their growing conditions. And then, we start looking at information like what inputs are they using. So inputs could be fertilizer, it could be seed. And we start with basic agronomic rules. We know that coffee performs well at a certain pH, soil pH. And we know when a soil pH is at a certain level. And, for example, in Indonesia, they were sitting at about a 4.3 pH. And ideally, they want to be at about 6 pH. We can calculate the area of the farm, and the agronomic rule says you need to add so much calcium carbonate per acre, per hectare, per square meter. And we can make that recommendation. Now, then we start adding in all those other factors. And just like your Waze app, you may change your route. Our machine learning combined with our statistical analysis that we do within the system is going to produce different results. And there's so much variability, so many variables in agronomy, not only from a livestock perspective, but from a crop perspective. We need to consider those and make recommendations and let the system learn from its results. So every year it gets more robust. Every crop season, you're changing a variable before you plant by affecting the calcium carbonate levels in your soil, and you don't see a result until 4 months later or 6 months later when that crop is produced. And during that 4 to 6 months, you got varying weather conditions and temperature and all of these factors. So certainly a consideration of our system and something that we need to continue to refine and build capabilities. And AI, machine learning, is such a great tool for that.
Yeah, well, this is kind of inspiring, that the Web3 vision of, the measurement and actuation of IoT, the, decision support and insight of AI and ML, and the state engine of blockchain for transparency of information and tracking and tracing and the like, that these things combining to, deliver really tangible value is really exciting to see in the real world. And my final question is kind of an extension of all of this. So, the technology is really exciting. The space you're over, I think, is very, very important. I also understand you've actually kind of already alluded to this, but I want to give you the opportunity to just flesh it out just a little more. But you have an academy, right? The Demetra Academy, that is trying to teach people how to use this technology to transform agriculture and livestock management. What, from a business standpoint, well, actually from any standpoint that you like, but what's the rationale behind doing that? Does it accelerate the rest of your business? How do you justify the investment in that academy and the education investment?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of ways that we approach that. The first way, from a business development perspective, we want to make contact with a lot of organizations, and we want to help people understand the difference of the way we did agriculture 10, 20, 30 years ago to what you can do today. So we offer free courses to ministries around the world, to organizations and cooperatives around the world, and have had hundreds of people attend these, where we just teach the basics of, here are different ways you can use blockchain, AI, satellite, drones as a tool to enhance your country's performance or your cooperative's performance. And then during that, we start looking at, how do we facilitate a good conversation, an educational conversation that allows a group, a cooperative, to take their productivity. And, we can see in Bolivia a group of quinoa farmers who are producing like 0.6 tons of quinoa per hectare, and know that they could triple or quadruple that as we go through it if they're applying the right agronomic principles. And hopefully that allows us to educate them on how to do that, whether they choose to use our system to help them to do that or not. There's great benefit to them. And there's a lot of good tools out there. And there's simple agronomic principles that people can apply. So from an investment perspective, I think, although it's a fairly large investment, the investment is quite low in a community-driven farming community in order to help teach this around the world. And a lot of my background has been training colleges and universities in blockchain and AI and other advanced technologies. And part of this maybe is self-serving in educating nations on how to use technology. But the bigger part and the most rewarding part to me is, how do you take an organization or a government that today doesn't apply blockchain or doesn't apply AI and teach them new ways to do that? And it's great to see initiatives spawn off of these training courses, and some of those involve us and some of those don't. And we have great relationships with the students who are, managers and directors at government agricultural ministries around the world, who will email me a year later and say, hey, we just invested in satellite technology in order to help us improve our corn output. And maybe they're struggling and they'll call us for a little bit of advice, and we'll help them from a consulting perspective.
Well,
it's exciting.
It is exciting, and it's very inspirational. I think it's wonderful that you and companies like Dimitra are out there tackling this very important problem, and that you're able to leverage this emerging Web3 technology to do that. It's great to hear this story. And thank you so much, John, for joining us today and sharing your thoughts about how Web3 technologies are transforming agriculture and can transform agriculture. So thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. And thank all of you for joining us for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find out more information on the important work that Dimitra is doing at dimitra.io. And you can also find out more research on this and many other topics at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. I'm your host, Doug Heintzman, and we thank you for joining us today, and we hope you will join us for our next episode of W3B Talks.
Excellent. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, everybody.